Right, good morning. I was just saying a few minutes ago, it almost looks like it rained. Like it's all wet out there. It's so nice, right? It's gonna be cold today. I love that. I know the hot weather is coming, so I'm gonna enjoy it while it lasts. And if you're looking at your syllabus, and I'm sorry, but I'll probably do this the whole rest of the way just because there's so little of our time left. If you count today, even we have 1, 2, 3, 4 classes left, and that's it. And one of them is today, and one of them is the final. So really, yeah, we have like 2 left. We don't count those 2, we have 2 left. But 4 classes, it's wild. We're really down to the end of the semester. It's hard to believe next week is May. My twins turn 8 this Sunday. So which is wild. I'm like, where did that time go? Crazy to think they're gonna be 8. I got 2 cakes because there's 2 of them, right? Like, I don't want to be a bad parent and not get them their own cake. So 1 chocolate, 1 white. Can't wait for the weekend. Lots of cake headed my way. But yeah, we're really, as I said, we're getting down to the end of the semester. I just wanted to let you know, and I'm sure you saw your scores, but I did grade all of the papers. And most of you did really, really well. I mean, the papers were fun on my part to read. As fun as a paper can be to write or read, right? I really enjoyed them. And I hope you did too. A lot of you just did beautifully. A lot of A's. The biggest thing people lost points for was like little tiny things, like 2 or 3 points. And for the most part, that was it. A lot of you just did beautifully. So if you have questions at any point about your grade or your score, you can always email me or come check in with me. It's a really good time. And I might have mentioned this before, but I'll mention it probably at least one more time. Really good time right now to be checking Canvas. Just make sure everything looks correct, that nothing is wrong or missing that shouldn't be. If it is, let me know. Really easy for me to fix that while we are still meeting and in person. Once we end the semester and I submit grades, it gets complicated. So if you see anything wrong or like you question marks at all, just let me know and we can take a look at it together. But otherwise, as I said, what we'll do today is we'll talk about the movie that we took 2 classes to watch. We'll talk about that worksheet and then I'll collect it from you. And we'll talk about it in relationship to a few things in chapter 14. And then we'll jump into 15, which is a relatively short chapter. And then next week we'll look at chapter 16, which is forensic psychology. So that's kind of our plan for the rest of the way. And then remember, our final will be online, just like the other ones. It's not cumulative in any way. So it's just a 3rd exam. And the study guide is up on Canvas if you wanted to start preparing. So just a kind of a little bit of housekeeping stuff to make sure we're all on the same page. Are there any questions about any of that stuff before we move into this? Feeling good? Is everyone exhausted? Right? Like it's coming, but like everyone has that tired look. My daughter woke me up like 17 times last night. It's a little dry. It's like 5, but it felt like 17, you know, like it felt like 17. I was like, you're turning 8 this weekend. You need to stop this. She's like, I have a mosquito bite and it itches at 2 in the morning. I'm like, it doesn't itch that badly. Go back to sleep. I feel tired today. I had extra coffee to make up for it. But what I want to do, I want to give you just maybe like 2 or 3 minutes, just a few minutes to kind of compare your thoughts with the people around you. And then we'll jump in and talk about it together. So go over your thoughts for numbers like 2, 3, 4, and 5. What are some of the things that you've got listed? What are some of the diagnoses you've got? If somebody has something that you don't, you're welcome to add it to your page. But take just a couple of minutes, check in with the people around you, and then we'll talk about it together. So just like another minute or two, then we'll talk together. All right, let's go for a few minutes. So what I want to do, we'll talk about it and then I'll collect it. And I heard a lot of like great parts of conversation, which is great. But let's get like a list going. I'm gonna make a big list for number 2. All of the things that we saw in Arnie that are like behavioral or thinking or emotional deficits, things that you noticed. So anyone want to give me one? Let's just get them started. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. I'm going to try and shorten them. So we'll say poor understanding of consequences. What's another one? Yeah. Okay. And other stuff. There should be a ton. So let's get anyone else should have a long list on there. Yeah. Yeah, he does a lot of repeating. Other things? Anybody? You're like, I'll keep going. Yeah. What was that? Okay, so not only for emotion regulation, but he has kind of extreme emotions. Okay, other stuff, you had your hand up as well, yeah.
I feel like lots of like motor movement.
Yeah, yeah, he has some like strange like motor stuff. Motor, I don't know if I say motor movement seems redundant, but I'll write it anyway. Yeah. Okay. Give your hand up as well.
I was gonna say has no sense of danger.
Okay, yeah, and that's kind of what the consequences would be, right? Danger up here as well, right? I keeps climbing that water tower, which is obviously very dangerous. Scares me every time I see him all the way up at the top up there, but for sure, yeah. Okay. Regard for people's feelings. What else? What other stuff? We could definitely add, it's definitely a few more. Yeah. Okay. Communication problems. What else? Look at your list. What else you got? What do you think? Yeah.
Gilbert is the same.
Well,
He was the.
Okay, so I'm trying to think how we could frame that in terms of Arnie. Maybe seeks care from Gilbert, or what do you think? I don't want to put words in you, but okay. Yeah.
Just like generally infantile mannerisms.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said I was waiting for someone to say it's kind of like infantile or childlike. He reminds me of my kids when they were like 5, maybe 6, right? And some of the things that he says and some of the things that he does. Anything else that we want to add? I think this is a big one, but anything else we can add here? Just check your list one more time, see if there's anything that we left out. I think a big one that I was waiting for someone to say he can't take care of himself, right? Like he needs a lot of care. Right, like the scene with the bathtub that he's still sitting in there right in the morning, right? He needed someone to help him and care for him. Let's see, what else? Anything else at all we want to add? We feel pretty good about that. What about for number 3, if you flip over for a moment here, and we'll talk about these in more detail. But what are you don't explain why, but what are some of the diagnoses that you came up with? Just thoughts, yeah. Okay, so we'll put ASD for autistic spectrum disorder. Anything else? What else did you think? Maybe even if it wasn't the whole picture. Anybody have a different one? There's 2 other ones that I think we could kind of add or talk about. Anybody else? Give you a hint, it's another like 3-letter abbreviation. Lots of abbreviations in this chapter. Anybody else? Yeah.
ADD.
ADD, okay, but we could say ADHD, right? There's one other really big one. Anybody else have something different? Yeah.
Is it IDD?
Yeah, IDD. Right, I think we have enough, like we could add like PTSD and no, I'm just like, we have enough acronyms here. Right, so those are some of the possible diagnoses that we can come up with for him. And I think if you have any of these 3, this one I would say captures him maybe the least, like, but there are elements of it. But if you have any of these 3, I think you are on the right track. So let's talk about them a little bit more. I'm going to go to ASD first. So autistic spectrum disorder. If I go down here a little bit, autistic spectrum disorder, if you've ever heard someone say they're on the spectrum or they have autism, both of those things would capture autistic spectrum disorder, right? It's a spectrum of disorders kind of ranging from mild to severe. And so how many of you thought maybe there was some kind of autism or ASD with Arnie, just by show of hands? A lot of you. So why? Why were you thinking autism? What were some of the reasons you came up with for why he might have ASD? A lot of you raised your hand. Yeah.
Raised with folks who are autistic.
Sure.
So it was very similar, very reactive. And also they have very similar motor movements.
Yeah.
When he's in a this like not comfortable situation, he'll hit his head a lot, which is something that I've seen behind that.
Mm-hmm.
As well as like you said, he can't really take care of himself. Like he'll listen to what people say depending on his mood, but also when he does listen, it'll be like he'll listen and he won't leave the back.
Right.
So
Yeah, I think some of his motor movements and like some of those repetitive things that he does are very, yeah, the gesture that he does over and over again, which we could add up here. He also does, nobody said it, but he does a lot of like counting and repeating. Right, the like, dad's dead, dad's dead, dad's dead, like repeating it over and over again. Or the counting, which is 1, 5, 10, 12, 11, like, I mean, it was really off, but like counting and repeating, which are along these lines, the squealing and some of the sounds that he makes. Leonardo DiCaprio did a good job of portraying him, I think, like way back. A lot of other people said ASD. Anybody else, other thoughts? Why you thought he might have autism? Anybody else? I know it's early. It would help me out, right? What do you think? Anything else? How about why he might not have autism? Anyone have a thought as to why he might not have ASD? Because I don't think it fits him perfectly, right? There are a lot of reasons why I think we could say he has autism, but it's not actually what I would choose if I had to diagnose him with something. Does anyone have a thought as to why it wouldn't fit this? Because there's a few things. Anybody? Yeah.
maybe because some of the symptoms that are related to autism disorder is also related to those symptoms.
Maybe, he has a few like of those like OCD like tendencies, but I don't think in any way it's like the most prevalent of what's going on with him, but it's a good thought. Yeah. Sure. Okay. So that's a good support for this, right? With ADHD, he definitely has a lot of hyperactivity, the impulsivity and like climbing, the tower and like kind of impulsive, reckless behaviors at times. He has a hard time focusing. There's one really big thing though that Arnie does that's very atypical of somebody who has autism. Look at his So oftentimes people who have autism, now this depends because it's a spectrum, are very uncomfortable with touch. Arnie's very like affectionate. That's not typical. The hugging, the touching, right? That's not something that you see very often in people who are on the spectrum. Now, again, that varies, but it's traditionally not something that you would see. He's much higher functioning than we typically see in someone who has autistic spectrum disorder. And again, it's a spectrum, but for the most part, language and communication problems are usually much more profound than we see in him. The motor movements, definitely, the repeating, definitely. Some of these things I would definitely say fit autistic spectrum disorder, but that like affection and decent communication and like the comfort with touch and the being okay without any kind of like routine, right? Those things aren't typically something that you see in someone who's on the spectrum. Yeah. Maybe it's a very common thing that people who have autism don't enjoy like a lot of physical contact. It makes them uncomfortable. Even though they're family, and they might grow to be okay with it with certain people, but you see him like even with Becky, who he barely knows, hugging her and being affectionate with her. And that's not very common. And again, the level of his functioning is way higher than we would typically see. My money, if I had to make a diagnosis, I would pick this one. I would go here. And the biggest reason that I would go here is the fact that he's childlike, right? The fact that he's turning 18, but he can't care for himself. He has poor like emotional regulation, poor understanding of consequences. Those are all things that you would tend to see in someone who's younger. Again, he reminds me a lot of my kids when they were like 5 or 6. And even at 5 or 6, they would get out of the bathtub. They'd get out of the bathtub and run naked through the house. Like they know not to stay in there. So in some ways, even like maybe younger, but some of the things that he says, the way he repeats them, can't care for himself, his language, very much remind me of a young child. And the fact that he needs care and isn't able to act his age and has these poor understandings and communication things, poor regard for people's feelings is very common as a child. Again, my daughter last night, I don't care that you're tired. My foot itches, right? It's like that. My life is all that matters. A lot of those things you would see in somebody who has intellectual developmental disorder. With this, you can have 4 different levels. I would put him at like mild or moderate because he is able to do some things for himself. And I think with the right like amount of training and help, he might be able to do even more. But if I had to choose one, and I think they blend IDD and ASD a lot in the film, and movies love to blend things together, I would go here. And again, a lot of that is due to that like childlike behavior. Yeah. I mean, usually you would pick one or the other. They're both very global diagnoses. And so what it would need to do is look at what are like the most prevalent of the things. And so with him, again, I would choose IDD because some of the things, the differential diagnosis stuff, the fact that he's comfortable with physical touch and that is not disturbed by routine being interrupted, really shies me away from autistic spectrum disorder. But you technically could go with like a developmental disorder not otherwise specified if he didn't fit either perfectly. But I think this one fits a little bit better. But if you had any of these, I think you're on the right track. And ADHD, if I go up for a moment, ADHD definitely doesn't capture everything, but you do see some elements of that in the film, right? He has like that kind of inattention and hyperactivity. As a side note, you mentioned ADD, right? Several years ago, ADD was eliminated, was kind of absorbed into ADHD. So if anyone ever tells you, oh, I have ADD, right, that doesn't actually exist anymore. It's all ADHD. And then we specify whether you have the inattention type or the hyperactive type. So ADD by itself is actually no longer its own diagnosis. Yeah.
Sorry, so look up. The DSM-5 doesn't include ADD?
No, it's completely been absorbed into this. So yeah, so ADD going back, gosh, it's been maybe like 8 or 9 years now, has not been recognized. And so what they found is that too many people who had ADD also had ADHD-like symptoms. And so they just kind of combine them together and you can specify which one fits best within the ADHD diagnosis. Another side note on that, if I go back again to autistic spectrum disorder, how many of you have heard of Asperger's before? Also has been eliminated. Okay, so Asperger's before the DSM-5 was its own distinct and unique diagnosis. It tends to be a slightly different presentation. It's someone who often has very high level functioning, very high intelligence, but poor social skills and poor social interactions. It's now part of the spectrum, right? So Asperger's has been absorbed into the autistic spectrum disorders and isn't its own unique diagnosis anymore either. So things that if I were to ask you either of those on like the final and the last exam, is ADD a diagnosis? Not anymore. And is Asperger's a diagnosis? Not anymore. They've both been absorbed into like a bigger umbrella. Yeah.
So you said that if you're autistic, you have a problem with like being touched.
Oftentimes, yeah.
Okay, because you just realized that my manager's daughter is autistic.
Sure.
She loves being home.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be like a mistake?
No, it's not always, right? As I said, it's not with every single person, but it's a very common trait. Is she kind of on the high end of the functioning spectrum or the low end? Okay, and sometimes when people are really low on the low end, so Down syndrome, right, or trisomy 21, often when people have Down syndrome, they're exceedingly affectionate and very like loving and hugging and love physical contact. So sometimes they get confused with each other, Down syndrome and autistic spectrum disorder. It's not very common for people who are on the spectrum to be comfortable with touch, unless they've gotten very comfortable with someone or maybe it's been developed early. There's always exceptions, right? But it's usually a criteria that people are kind of uncomfortable. Not always, but usually, yes.
When I heard the word ADD, I thought it was a diagnosis that you didn't have ADHD and then you got it in the future. Is that related to it?
How do you
let's say that like someone has ADHD and you take their medication and then we know how their medication calms them down because they're up, but someone who isn't on or who doesn't have ADHD takes it and then they have the upper effects, wouldn't they be able to eventually like have the calming effects from it?
Well, so, and I think it might have been my other abnormal psych class that we talked about this, but yeah, when people have ADHD, it's so counterintuitive. We give them a stimulant, right? And the stimulant actually calms them down. Where Ritalin is a stimulant and it mellows you. The thought is actually that you're understimulated. And that's why you need a stimulant to help calm you down. And so interestingly, someone who has ADHD, like my partner has ADHD, right? And oftentimes you outgrow it. It's a childhood disorder, but it can last into adulthood, or you can outgrow it. But for her, if she drinks a cup of coffee, it actually kind of calms her down and makes her tired. If I drink a cup of coffee before bed, I'm not sleeping. Like there's no way. She could literally have a cup of coffee in bed and there's no way I can do that after like 4 in the afternoon. And so sometimes it's almost like an informal diagnostic like criteria. So it's obviously not formal, but people who have ADHD oftentimes stimulants have a calming effect. And it's something that people sometimes use as a way to self-regulate. My cousin, or it's my nephew has ADHD and he drinks a cup of coffee every day before school as a way to help him focus and calm down before he goes to school, rather than taking like Ritalin or medication. So the idea is that people who have ADHD, you know, like the stimulant calms them down. And ADD is just, again, it used to be a different subtype, but it's just been completely eliminated. And you can outgrow it. It usually develops in people in childhood, right? It's a childhood disorder. And it's difficult to tell, you know, what's normal versus ADHD. I mean, think about it. I imagine a lot of you right now would rather not be sitting in your chairs, sitting here, and it might be hard for you to focus and pay attention. And you see a lot of that in childhood, right? Kids go off to school and they struggle to sit in their desk, pay attention and maintain like under control. That's actually pretty normal, right? Kindergartners especially, and then it gets a little better as you get older, but it tends to be something that's more severe or more impacting than someone who might not have it. So yeah, ADHD is an interesting one. A lot of people struggle with it. A lot of people outgrow it, but it can also persist into adulthood. Yeah.
And just one random question, because like there's different generations that get raised, like how the last generation they had ADD and now our generation does not have ADD.
Sure.
from the older generation, they would sometimes believe that it wouldn't be real, like ADHD, because it was based off of how the parents raised the kid,
Mhm.
if they gave the kid attention or didn't give them attention.
Sure.
Do you think that's related to anything?
I mean, it could be every generation has its like things that are somewhat common, right? And when ADHD and ADD were first discovered, there was so much controversy. I mean, so much stigma. Now it's something that's much better understood and a lot less stigmatized. There's still stigma with any mental illness, but it's much less so. So I think if you look at any generational thing, like there are things now that weren't disorders when 10 years ago, and there'll be things 10 years from now that aren't disorders now. It's always evolving and changing, and I do think some of them are somewhat generational. Like we're going to see a lot of stuff because of COVID. I imagine the next DSM is going to have some more like focus on some of those kind of isolation things that are prevalent. See a lot more substance abuse now and depression. Those things are more common because people have been isolated for 2 years. The anxiety, a lot more anxiety in our world now, right? People like, I had a student come to my office yesterday crying because she had an exam for the first time in person in 2 years and didn't know how to handle it. She's like, I've like forgotten how to take an exam in person. Like, it's so scary. It's different to me. Just the world is so different. And oftentimes disorders and the changes in the DSM kind of reflect that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Piggybacking off this comment.
Yeah.
Do you think there's gonna be a lot more issues like they were saying because they're being raised off iPads and TV as opposed to kids from older generations that were outside a lot?
Right. Maybe.
So,
Yeah. I mean, I could see that for sure. Yeah, I mean, my kids don't go outside and play. Like, and versus when I was growing up, that's all I did, like play football in the street and, so it's different. Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. That's all that matters to my children, like their technology. That's like their whole world, Yeah. Oh, so much so. And so I think, all of those things are very cultural and generational. And I think that they shape a lot, like the attention span of children now, I think is very different than the attention span. I mean, and even all of us, right? Like the amount of multitasking that most of us can do. I mean, my mother-in-law can't even like send a text without like stopping everything and like focusing with the one finger. Right? Like I can like send a text while sending an email while doing like 3 other things and it doesn't even faze me. So I think that, you see a lot of those generational things. For sure, it's just constantly evolving, which is why they changed the DSM so much to try and reflect that stuff and the research and the trends, right? Yeah.
No, the quarantine thing, I think it's a lot more anxiety in children. Because my 13-year-old cousin was just diagnosed with anxiety.
Sure.
Dreams, but it only started when they went into quarantine.
Yeah.
Do you think that will be like a common thing with a lot of plants?
It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, my oldest tends to be a little on the shyer side. And as a result of COVID, it just like launched her all the way to shy, right? She used to be someone who would like, with a little bit of coaxing, would like get in there and like interact with people. And now I feel like she's like extremely introverted because of COVID. And so I think that it will have those kind of long-term effects. I mean, just think how much it's changed everything. 2 years doesn't seem like that long, but it's a really long time. And people have really, my definition of crowded has changed so much. Like I used to go to the grocery store and not even think anything of it. Now, if I'm at the store and there are like 8 people, I'm like, it's crowded in here. I'm like this, right? And my definition of space, I forget what we were watching. We're watching like a show on TV last night, and somebody sat down right next to the person. I was like, what are they doing? Like back up 6 feet, people, like even 4 feet. It's changed everything. Yeah, right. I don't know how many of you have that moment where you're watching a show and you're like, they're not masked, right? Like, and it's not so bad now that, a lot of us are starting to take them off. But I mean, I carry mine around with me everywhere. I don't know how many of you are like that, but like everywhere I go, I have it just in case, right? It's like my little security blanket. And I take it on and I put it off, which makes no sense. But yeah, I mean, so many things have changed. And you see that with these disorders as well. Like bipolar disorder used to be manic depression because we discovered other types of mania, right? And we see, we didn't talk about it here. We talked about PTSD, but there's a newer one that's gaining popularity of CPTSD, right? Someone who has complex trauma that starts in childhood. And there's all these disorders that are kind of on the plate that might be added or removed depending on what's going on in our world. Yeah. You know, they're always working on it. So I'm not sure when the next one is scheduled to come out. It's usually like every 7 to 10 years. And we're getting close to that. I think we might be past the 7-year mark. So it should be, I mean, they usually update it every like 7 to 10 years. And they're probably, I mean, there's a panel of thousands of people who are working on it always. And then it takes all that time to review everything, come to a consensus, and then publish it. I don't know, someone should look it up if there's a DSM. Yeah. Yeah, 2013. So I'm like, we're past 7, but before 10. So it should be relatively soon. Though I don't know when it's coming out. I'm not sure if there's anything been announced. Someone could look it up. If anyone finds it online, like when it's supposed to come out, like let me know.
The DSM-6.
It might be, or like the DSM-4, they then did what was called a text revision. So they had the DSM-4 TR. So they might do DSM-5 like revised, or they could make a whole new DSM-6. Right? Yeah, they keep updating it every few years. Again, if anyone looks it up and finds it, I mean, it's a race. Waiting for someone to find it. All right. So again, if I had to go back to these, I would lean here. But there's a lot of overlap. And as I said, the media loves to overlap with disorders. Let's look at number 4 really quickly. What do you think are some of the things that might have contributed? Now, you might speculate a little bit because we don't have all the information. But what are some things that might play a role in either making it worse or causing some of Arnie's problems? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's rather like kind of lashed out of it a little bit.
Mhm.
Because it's that was causing it, and he's doing what he's doing.
Yeah.
So their lack of understanding and his understanding could cause like it pretty much.
Oh, for sure. And I think, you know, you all should have the family on there in some capacity. I do think that the family environment, the lack of like understanding and knowledge of what to do is definitely contributing. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. They have a little revision. I don't know if it's been completely, because they did it for our textbook. They, like the book that we have for this class, they made like a addendum to it. And so I don't know when they're going to like launch that 100%, but that's good to know. Thank you. Again, always being revised. What else can we say with number 4? So the family. Anyone else have thoughts? Like what else could be contributing, even if you are speculating a little bit? What do you think? Other causes or contributions for this behavior? Yeah.
The small town that he lives in.
Yeah, the very small, like rural town. And we never see any school, right? It may be summer. I get the impression it's summer. We don't see any like evidence of like schooling or education at all. Very small town for a lot of very minimal options. Yeah.
So like living in a small town and like maybe being like secluded does not help.
Yeah.
Like he didn't really have much social interaction.
Yeah.
He didn't meet too many people. So could have looked up
Oh, for sure. Right. I would hate to live in that town. It's like such an everyone, like part of everything. It's so small, too small. Right. Anyone have any other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. Yeah. That's something that would happen, right? If you had a child who was arrested for putting themselves into danger, there'd be a social worker there, right? I mean, they detained him, right? And so, like, whether or not it would go on his record or not, but they would probably take him into custody for his own protection. It would depend. It would depend on the circumstance. I mean, he's obviously, you know, in a small town, sometimes the rules get bent a little bit. They're a little bit more, you know, it's a little different, but it would depend. It would depend on the circumstance for sure. I always speculate that maybe he loves to climb that tree, right? Like we see him climbing the tree all the time. I always wonder if maybe something happened when he was younger, like he fell like climbing or had some kind of injury, or maybe there was something during pregnancy with his mom. Like it just kind of speculating a little bit. It seems like he's had, you know, whatever is going on with him since he was very young. They talk about him not living as long as he was expected to. Relatively common that people who have severe like IDD or ASD sometimes have shortened lifespans because they put themselves into more danger, especially when they don't have resources or family to support them in like a healthy way. I also sometimes wonder, I don't know if you picked up on this, but the dad hung himself, right? He committed suicide in the basement, and they're kind of like a little ambiguous about that, but that's what happened. So clearly there was some mental illness in the family. And so I wonder if that might have played a role. I think all of those things together probably are contributing. What can we do to help him? How about number 5? Like, how could we, and go to the last slide where it has a few thoughts on that. How could we help Arnie out or the family out? Yeah, we'll go here. Yeah. Yeah. Patience, I like that, right? And definitely some education and training within the family. Did you have a thought too? Yeah.
Still haven't worked with their stuff.
Yeah.
And then like 24-hour caregiver, because do it, like I mean,
Right.
they try their best, especially like Gilbert, but it's still not enough for him.
Yeah. I think a caregiver, like a behavioral aid that helps out the family therapy, family education, all of those things could be really, really helpful, I think, for him. I really believe that with some help and some like guidance and education, he could do a lot more, right? I think that we could push him and help him to grow a little bit. Did you want to?
Well, yeah. Like she actually got him. Like,
Becky?
Yeah.
Mhm.
got him to-
Yeah.
Do things differently. I think that makes it. I think she plays like a better, like the way she treats him is more. Okay, someone likes her will treat it.
Yeah. She definitely had a little more like patience and understanding for him, for sure. Anybody have any other thoughts? Anything else that we could do to help him out? So almost, yeah. Speech therapy, okay, to help him like communicate a little bit better, for sure. Schooling, right, getting him, if he's not in school, right, getting him into like a better, like more formal like school setting, something where he has a little more stimulation both socially and academically. I think there's a lot that could be done to help him out. And obviously, I think the family plays a really big role. I think this movie, even though it's old, it really lends to like a good discussion of these things because they don't portray any of them clearly. And again, that's something you see constantly in the media, blending dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia to make it more dramatic, right? So many like very popular movies do that. And I think this movie's no exception in kind of blending them all together. And again, I think it's a good example of all of that. Any other thoughts, comments, anything else about Arnie or Gilbert or the movie or anything at all before I collect them from you? Any other thoughts? All right, make sure your names are on those and then go ahead and pass them up. All right. So obviously we didn't cover everything in chapter 14. So anything that we kind of didn't discuss, make sure you kind of look over, maybe make sure you've especially read through the chapter if you haven't already. We're going to move on to 15. But, you know, when you're looking at the study guide, if there's anything in there that we didn't kind of cover in relation to Arnie, obviously make sure you look that over a little bit on your own. And then what we'll do is we'll shift to the other end of life here. So we talked about disorders of childhood, and now we'll talk about disorders of aging. And I chose this picture, kind of funny. My grandma, who lived to be 103, right, which is wild. That's some longevity right there. And my partner's grandpa is 102, and her grandma lived to 101. I got some long like years going, but those years are rough around 100. 100 is pretty up there, right? I was going to say it's pretty old, which is true. But my grandma always said that she was well seasoned, right? And I thought that was kind of gross, but kind of cool at the same time. Like she's like, I'm very well seasoned after she hit 100. And I always think of like, you know, like the seasons and and kind of getting older, like the turning into like the fall and the colors changing. So hence the color choice for this. Makes me think of my grandma and her well-seasoned years, whatever that means. But we'll look at here some of the disorders related to getting older and the changes that happen as we age. And this is a whole branch of psychology, right? You can study geropsychology, which is the study of people who are elderly. And in our culture, we define elderly as beyond the age of 65, right? So 65 and older. And different cultures define elderly in different ways, but that's our society's definition. And just like any other age, whether it's childhood or adolescence or adulthood, we have special pressures and upsets and biological changes, unique things that are happening as we age. And we can define the disorders that we're going to talk about into like two different groups, right? And we'll spend more time on the second group. But there are disorders that are common among people of any age and can also happen to people who are older. These are the disorders we've been talking about all semester, right? Depression, anxiety, and so on. They're on the next slide. We'll talk about them for a moment. And then there are disorders which are very common to people who are older. Those are disorders of cognition, like the dementias and the neurocognitive disorders. And that's what we'll focus mostly on as we get into the disorders for this topic. But we can have things that are common to everyone at any age, and then disorders that are related specifically to cognition. So the disorders common for any age, and again, these are ones that we've talked about all semester. People who are elderly can suffer from all the same things we've been covering: depression, anxiety, substance abuse, schizophrenia, right? Any of the things that we've covered over the course of the semester. Relatively common for people as they get older and maybe lose people who matter to them or retire and lose some of that sense of purpose, to struggle with depression. We see a lot of like depression and anxiety in people who are elderly, but we can see those things in people who are younger as well, right? They're kind of across all ages. Substance abuse, of course, just like at any age. Though interestingly, when people are in their elderly ages, what we see is substance abuse in kind of a different way. People who are elderly are more likely to abuse prescription medication than any other type of medication, right? And this can take a couple of different forms. I feel like I'm picking on my mother-in-law today, but my mother-in-law, like, she'll be prescribed like 500 milligrams of something to take once a day, right? Her doctor will give her like a 500 milligram, like Motrin or something, take this once a day, and that will help you. And she'll have that like, well, if one a day is good, I'll take 3 because that'll work, right? Like, I know better and I'll take 3, right? That's one way that we sometimes see that appear. It could also be going from doctor to doctor and seeking pain medication and seeking drugs, or taking them and not realizing that you've already taken it. We see that a lot, kind of accidental substance abuse in people who are elderly and are having like memory lapses. Did I already take my medication? I can't remember. Taking it again, and then sometimes having negative side effects from them. So you can abuse prescription medication just like any other kind of drug. And you see that more in elderly populations, abusing prescription drugs more so than any other category. And then psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, those things can happen when you're elderly or younger, just like any age. So these are common among all ages and not so much what we're interested in as much as the disorders of cognition. I'm going to erase this, put some stuff up here. Sometimes I can't believe that we have chalkboards. I was volunteering at my kids' school yesterday, and they have like smart boards, and like they're like these beautiful smart boards, and the kids go up there and draw on them and do things. I'm like, I have a chalkboard, like, but okay. And sometimes no Wi-Fi, but it's another story. But these disorders of cognition are the most common in people who are elderly, right, over the age of 65. And as we age, it's kind of a harsh reality, but as we age, our memory starts to decline. How many of you have had a parent or grandparent tell you the same story repeatedly, right? Like there's almost all of you probably. My like in-laws, my mom, like, it's always the same story over. And I'm like, Mom, you've told me this like 3 times today, like trying to be kind, right? And I'm always repeating. My grandparents were always repeating stories. That's common, right? As we get older, we forget. a little bit more and a little bit more, even starting in our 20s. We have a slow decline that begins with memory. And that doesn't mean we can't reverse it or slow it, but it is there. Right? More and more, we have those moments where we walk in a room and we're like, why are we here? Right? I have this all the time. Like, and it happens when you're tired or distracted. Like, other things can fuel it as well. But you walk in a room and you can't remember why you came in there. Right? You can't remember where you put your keys. You forget somebody's name. You can't find the right word. All of those things are very, very common little memory mishaps. And they get more prevalent as you get older, but they're normal. Right? We don't worry about that so much. But there are people who experience way more extensive changes in memory and cognitive ability. And those are kind of the disorders of dementia, neurocognitive disorders that we'll get into a little bit in a moment. There's a distinction to make, though, something that we sometimes confuse. There's something called delirium. And then there's another category called like dementia, which are now called the neurocognitive disorders. Delirium is a really like rapid clouding of consciousness. It's something that has a very fast onset. It comes on very, very quickly, and it doesn't tend to last a very long time. If you can figure out what caused someone to have a delirium, it's often easy to fix or treat. So a delirium, for example, maybe somebody has a really, really high fever, and all of a sudden they have no idea where they are. They're confused. They might be hallucinating, right? They are out of it, right? They're delirious, hence the term, right? Or maybe they have a stroke or an infection, right? It's usually brought on by like a specific medical condition. And if you can treat the infection or treat whatever condition is causing it, you might be able to reverse it and reverse it very quickly. I went into the hospital, what was it, like 2 weeks ago, and I was in a delirium, right? It was like 3 a.m, and my partner had to drop me off and then go back home because our kids were at home sleeping, but I couldn't drive myself there. I had no idea where I was. She dropped me off at the emergency room and see me, and I just started crying because I had no idea where I was. Like, my blood pressure was so high that I couldn't even see or think straight. I had no idea of like reality, right? And that happens with a delirium. The second my blood pressure came down, like everything came right back. I knew where I was, I knew what was going on, and I was fine. But we get this with delirium, that it's like a very rapid clouding and confusion of consciousness. And then we can't follow a normal thought. We might hallucinate, but we can treat it and fix it if we identify it and turn it around. Dementia, or the neurocognitive disorders, are the complete opposite. They have a very slow onset. Years. It develops and builds slowly over years. It's not fast at all. It could take 2, 3, 4, 8, 10 years to slowly develop a neurocognitive disorder or dementia. And unfortunately, they're difficult, if not impossible, to treat or fix. Most of the dementias, the neurocognitive disorders, are not reversible. They're fatal. Right after a certain number of years, they ultimately take your life. Right, and it's a very slow, long process versus this is something that's very quick and we can reverse it. So just a little bit of a distinction to make between the two. And there are lots of different types of dementia. The most common by far is Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. It is the most common type of dementia. And it was named after Alois Alzheimer, who was the first one to identify in 1901. You don't need to know the year or anything, but just as a side note. And with this disease, it's, again, the most common form of dementia, typically occurring over the age of 65. A sobering statistic for you: 1 in 10 people over the age of 65 will get Alzheimer's. 1 in 10, 10%, that's a lot. And as it stands right now, it's typically like 8 to 10 years, and then it ultimately does claim your life, right? It is a very, very difficult disease. And we have a lot of interventions and treatments that we're working on. So there's a lot of hope for the future. But as it stands right now, it is something that affects a lot of people. Yeah. I think if anything, yeah, it's gone up a little bit. Right? And I don't know if we know that for sure, right? It's so hard to know. There's a correlation or causation. But what we see is as people live longer and longer, and technically our lifespan is actually, or like our life expectancy is actually decreased because of COVID by a couple of years. But the longer that we live, the more vulnerable we are to dementia. So the older you get, the more likely it is to develop. My partner's grandma, who passed away last year, was sharp and clear until 99. I mean, like really with it and lucid until 99, and then started to develop like dementia. And so what we see is as people get through their 60s and 70s into their 80s and 90s, they just become more and more likely as a product of aging to develop things like Alzheimer's. Yeah.
What's the difference between somebody saying that their grandma has dementia versus grandma?
So-
Like the severity?
So dementia, think about dementia as like an umbrella, right? So underneath the umbrella, like if this was dementia. So dementia is like a category, right? And underneath that, we would have Alzheimer's, we'd have Lewy body dementia, which we're talking about, you'd have Huntington's, right? You'd have all these, so it's a type. So in a way, they're saying the same thing, right? Alzheimer's is a type of dementia, or Lewy body dementia is a type of dementia. So, and people tend to use them very interchangeably, so they're kind of referring to the same thing. How many of you have had someone in your life struggle with Alzheimer's, someone that you knew or know? A lot of you. It's a difficult thing for family. It's a difficult thing for the person who has it. My dad passed away from Alzheimer's 3.5 years ago. He actually had, we'll talk about this in a minute, he had Lewy body dementia, which is very similar to Alzheimer's. But I mean, he lived with it for 15 years. Lewy body is a little bit longer span, but really, really hard, right? And if you've known someone who has it, they have pockets of lucidity, which I think is what makes it so difficult. Like one day they might not know who you are, and the next day they remember. It could even be moment to moment. But it moves from like very current, like little mishaps and small short-term memory stuff to moving farther and farther and farther back. A lot of you raised your hand. Any like stories or comments, people in your life who had it, grandparents or parents, or anything about the people that you knew who had it or know who had it? We always said, yeah, go ahead.
My great grandmother had it, and she actually just recently passed away.
Mhm.
98 or something.
Yeah.
But she lived in a home for the remainder of her life, and she would often get calls about her attachment to nurses.
Yeah.
So my dad and often had to go help her.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really sad. Eventually it starts to affect your personality, and so people become very different than the people that they were. Really? Okay, for her that was pretty typical. So yeah, interesting. Maybe less of a filter in doing it, but yeah, that's hard, right? Grandma's losing it on the staff, right? Yeah, it's tough the way that it can affect your behavior as it progresses. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Married for a very long time.
Yeah.
She passed away like 3 years before he did.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to always say that it was a good thing that he had Alzheimer's because he didn't remember who she was.
Yeah.
So he couldn't grieve the loss of her.
Right.
So as hard as that was, it
Yeah.
was a good thing that he didn't. So
Yeah, I can resonate with that because I was saying that my partner's grandma passed, and her grandpa is like he's 101 or 102. He's up there. He's like over 100. He's old, right? Very, very, very well seasoned. But he at this point he doesn't remember her, and in a way, as sad as that is, it's a blessing for him because he's not devastated by her constant loss. But there are moments where he remembers and looks around for her, and then we'll explain like she's no longer here. And he goes through the grieving, and then 5 minutes later doesn't remember her. And so it's like this constant reminder, which can be really difficult for the people in that person's life. Kind of funny in a way. You have to find the humor in things in life whenever possible, right? my dad, toward the end of his life, he would look at my mom. They were married for 40 years. He would look at her and be like, did I ever get married? And she'd be like, yeah, to me. And every time, it was so cute. Like, bless him for like, however this happened, every time she would say that, he would light up like, oh, hi, like, nice to meet you, right? Like, he didn't remember her, but he always looked so excited whenever she said that, like, yeah, I'm your wife. He'd be like, oh, hello. Like, he never looked disappointed, like, to his, like, which, thank God, right? How sad would that be? But he always looked so like, oh, and he would reread books. He'd be like, I'm going to watch this movie. I've never seen it before. And he's like, it's new every time. Like, he would try and find the humor in it too. He had a great sense of humor. But it's really difficult as it progresses. Like, it starts with little things and then it just moves backward. And so he and my mom had been married for 40 years. And so, by the time it hit that point, 40 years back, like, he was talking about people that none of us knew, right? It kind of moves backward through time. And it's caused by these two things up here, neurofibrillary tangles and senile plaques. Now, every single one of us has these things, but they build up as we age. They build up in our system and in our brain, these twisted protein fibers and deposits of what we call beta amyloid proteins. And they interfere with the way that neurons communicate. They interfere with how memories are stored. And they start to slowly progress through the brain in stages until somebody can't remember anymore. And I have a little video that kind of highlights that progress. I'm going to play it for you, or that process rather. Let me bring this up. Where are we? So it's just a couple of minutes, but it's sorry, I'm just clicking on things randomly now. It's a nice overview of Alzheimer's. Let me pause this. How it progresses and it moves through the brain in kind of an unpredictable way, which is why sometimes people get those pockets of lucidity that can appear and then disappear. But again, the most common of all the dementias, so it'd be the most common type of dementia, really caused by these plaques and tangles. Also, some different neurotransmitters play a role. Something I'm always asked, and maybe you've wondered about, is this genetic, right? And it can be, but only if it occurs before the age of 55. After 65, it's just considered a disorder of aging, right? So if you have relatives, family members, whoever, that have had Alzheimer's or one of these dementias, it doesn't mean that you're more vulnerable to get it if they got it when they were older. If they got it in their late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever, then you're not any more vulnerable than the average person. But if they got it in their late 50s, right, or even earlier, then it tends to have more of a genetic component. And we'll talk more next time about like some prevention methods and things you can do to delay onset if you might be vulnerable to it, which there are tests you can take to find out, although they're not perfect. We'll talk more about that as well. But it does not tend to be genetic unless it occurs at a very young age, which would be before the age of 65. So just something to maybe reassure you, if it runs in your family or there are people in your family who've had it, you're not any more vulnerable if they've had it after 65. There are other types of dementias or neurocognitive disorders. Remember, neurocognitive disorders and dementia mean the same thing. Lewy body dementia, very similar to Alzheimer's, with just a few variants. People tend to live a little bit longer. With this one, it's a little slower. But with this one, it's related to these protein deposits called Lewy bodies, which are named after the person who discovered them. And it presents very similarly to Alzheimer's, except it has a few more like movement related issues. And it's very common that people who have this hallucinate, right? So oftentimes as they get toward the end of their life, they see things that aren't there, almost like psychosis-like symptoms. And then they start to have problems walking and moving, much more so than you might see with Alzheimer's. So very similar in the memory loss and cognitive personality changes, but a few slight differences. Vascular neurocognitive disorder or dementia is actually relatively common. People who have memory loss due to some kind of cerebrovascular event, like a stroke or head trauma or like brain trauma in some way, something that restricts blood flow to part of the brain, can result in a dementia or like a loss of cognitive ability due to a cerebrovascular like incident. So again, like a stroke or a heart attack, head trauma, those kind of things. That's actually the second most common type of dementia. These two are really rare. Pick's disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Creutzfeldt-Jakob is the mad cow equivalent in humans. Really rare, but it is something that is like a very slow, long-acting virus. Very few cases of it documented, but I put it up here as an example. And Pick's disease is another type of virus that picks small little holes in the brain. And those small little holes show up in the frontal lobe and temporal lobe and start to affect memory, cognition, and just general behavior and ability. These two are way more common, Huntington's and Parkinson's. I'm sure you've heard of these two. Huntington's is very genetic. I always think of House, right? There's a character on House like years ago who had Huntington's or ran in her family. It's at 13 or whatever, I forget what her name is. But Huntington's disease is a lot of movement and personality related things. It's something that's, as I said, very genetic. It's like a 50% like genetic tendency to develop it. Parkinson's is a lot more like tremors and rigidity and unsteadiness. If you've ever heard someone say they have Parkinsonian-like symptoms, it means there's often like shaking or tremors. I have a friend who's in his late 50s, and he's always like this, always shaking. Like every he hands you something, it's just like violently shaking. And it's just something he's had like his whole life. Parkinsonian symptoms reference like tremors and rigidity. A couple of very famous people who have this, it tends to be something that is very slow moving, but affects your ability to walk and have motor movements, and very much causes a lot of shaking and tremors and restlessness. So there's a lot of different types of these, but by far Alzheimer's is the most common, followed by vascular dementia and then Lewy body and so on. All of these again falling under that umbrella of like neurocognitive disorders or dementias. Any other thoughts or questions, thoughts, comments, stories, anything at all here? Before I move on. There's a lot about like treatment and early intervention. I have a clip that goes with this, so I think I'll stop here rather than like take us all the way up to the last minute. But what we'll do when I see you on Tuesday is we'll finish this up. We have a couple slides left. We'll talk about the rest of them, and then we will move on to our last chapter, which is chapter 16. So if I didn't for some reason get your sheets, make sure that you turn that into me. Otherwise, have a wonderful weekend. I'll think of you. I'll eat a piece of cake for each of you, or how about a bite of cake for each of you? A piece for each of you might be excessive, maybe. I don't know. But have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you all on Tuesday. Bye. Take care.